well-known, most honored movies of all time. I don't know if it's still true, but for many, many years it had won more Academy Awards than any other movie. I think it won 12, and Titanic might have passed it in later years, but it was a true epic, and it's a very long movie. If you watch it, it takes about 3 hours to see the whole movie. If you ask people about it, or you mention it, most people, the thing that comes to mind is the chariot race, right? That there's the big climactic chariot race, and I remember seeing an interview with Charlton Heston, and he said that he realized as a young actor when he got the part that this was going to be a big part of his career, but that he was worried about the chariot race, that he had, oddly enough, like most of us, never been in a chariot before. And he went to the director, this young actor goes to the director and very earnestly says, you know, I'm not sure that I can pull off the chariot race. And the director apparently looked at him and smiled and said, kid, if you just stand where I tell you to, I promise you, you're going to win the race. Anyway, that's what most people think of when they think of her. You might not know this, but before it was a movie, it was actually a Broadway play and ran for years and years, and they even did the chariot race on stage somehow. What you might not know is that the full title of the play and the movie is Ben-Hur, a story of the Christ. A story of the Christ. And that might seem odd to you, even if you've seen the movie, because Christ only appears in 3 short scenes. And in the last one, we don't even see his face. We merely see his sandals and recognize that he's carrying the cross up the hill. But I don't know when the last time you saw the movie. By the end of the movie, the title character, Judah Ben-Hur, his mother and sisters are all followers of the Christ. But it demonstrates, I think, the power that God has, that in a movie that goes for over 3 hours and covers spectacle and special effects and stuff, that the person of Christ can capture that movie in just 3 short scenes. God's like that he doesn't have to be very flashy to make his presence known. And as we look at today's text, I want to say that, in fact, while God's name is not going to be mentioned in any of the 10 verses that I'm going to read to you, that today's text is very much about God. This is from Exodus chapter 2, verses 1 through 10. Now a man from the house of Levi went and married a daughter of Levi. The woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw that he was beautiful, she hid him for 3 months. But when she could hide him no longer, she got him a wicker basket and covered it over with tar and pitch. And then she put the child into it and set it among the reeds by the bank of the Nile. His sister stood at a distance to find out what would happen to him. The daughter of Pharaoh came down to the Nile to bathe with her maidens walking along the Nile, and she saw the basket among the reeds and said to her maid, and sent her maid, and they brought it to her. When she opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the boy was crying, and she had pity on him and said, "This is one of the Hebrew children." Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and call a nurse for you from the Hebrew women so that she may nurse the child for you?" Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Go ahead." So the girl went and called the child's mother. Then Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages." So the woman took the child and nursed him. The child grew, and she brought him into Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. And she named him Moses and said, "Because I drew him out of the water." Like I said, that this is a passage that's about God, even though God is not mentioned. And there's some other things that aren't mentioned, but it's very much what the passage is about. I would contend to you that one of the things that this story is about faith. Even though the word faith is never used, we see a good picture of it. I was actually talking to someone just before the story. We were talking about the fact that if you tell me what decade you were born, I could probably tell you something about the kind of person you are. That if you were born during the Depression, I told you a couple of weeks ago about how in the mid-70s I was working on my uncle's farm back in Tennessee, and at a time when houses cost less than $20,000, he paid $50,000 cash for a wheat combine. They were wealthy farmers, but they were raised in and worked in the Depression, and at the same time that my Uncle Paul was handing over $50,000 in cash for a wheat combine, I promise you my Aunt Minnie was saving aluminum foil. Because you just don't throw stuff away when you've been raised during the Depression. Once you've experienced that time of scarcity and lack of resources, it affects the way you act. It affects the way you act. If you were born during World War II, then that decade left its mark on you. I was born during the 50s, and so I love to watch television. They call it the Beaver Decade, and I never did like that show, but I watched other shows. And my dad went to work, and my mom stayed home, and I went to school, and we had one car, and we had one television set, and we were the American family of the 50s. And that decade has a certain personality for the people that were born into it. Again, if you were born into the 60s or the 70s, that decade had its own personality. The 80s were called the decade of greed, and we're probably still paying for that. But again, the time that you are born in has a lot of impact on the kind of person you turn out to be. Moses was born in a time that up till then was the lowest point in the history of his people. We talked last week about how as the Hebrew people became more and more numerous, Pharaoh began to be afraid that they would become a threat to national security. And his answer to that problem was to put them in bondage. And the scripture said he treated them ruthlessly and gave several illustrations of how he made them labor and work long, hard hours as basically as punishment for being Hebrews. But apparently they flourished under harsh conditions and became even more numerous. And so at the time of today's story, at the time of Moses' birth, the next step in Pharaoh's plan was to order all Hebrew male children killed in the Nile. You have a Hebrew baby, if you're a Hebrew couple, you have a son, you were mandated by the king, by the Pharaoh, to drown that child in the river. That was the time that Moses was born into. And I would tell you that this passage we read today then is a story of faith. Because Moses' parents didn't do that, did they? And if you study the Old Testament, if you study the New Testament, if you study any documents really about royalty up until the 20th century just about, if a king or a pharaoh or an emperor gives an edict, makes an order, gives a command, and you don't follow it, it's hardly ever a misdemeanor. Right? There weren't any, you defy the Pharaoh, you don't go before the court and get community service. Right? Pharaoh would not send you to anger management classes if you disobeyed him. Do you understand?